In this video, I'll be going over how you can connect to a database from your .NET application. I have created a blank new project. This particular project is a Razorpage project, but the way you connect to the database is the same if you are using the MVC project type in .NET. So, in order to connect to a database, we first need a database to connect to. Now, I will be using Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, which you can just Google and download. It's basically just a local host environment where you can connect to the database and you can work with it just on your local host environment. And the cool thing is that if you integrate it with Visual Studio, it's very easy for you to synchronize it to the live environment. So the SQL server will look something like this. It will provide you with the server name, and that is what we will need later. So first, let us create a model that we actually want in the database, because we will be using the code first approach, which is my favorite thing about the .NET environment. So let us first create a folder to hold our models. So I will add a new folder. I'll call it models. And I will add a new class. And we can just call this one product. So a product will have a few different properties. I will write prop and then press tab twice for the shortcut. And I usually, or well, pretty much always have an ID property, which will be the primary key. I will also give it a string of name. And let's give it a double of price. I think that's enough for a simple product. Now, we can use something called data annotations, where we can specify that the ID is the primary key. Now, it won't recognize this because we have to import data annotations, so I can press Control dot, and it will suggest that we use this data annotation. And there we go. Now it recognizes the data annotation, and I've specified that this is the primary key. Now, it actually does assume if you have an ID property that it is the primary key, so this one you don't need it, but it's just to show what data annotations are and how you can use them. There are tons of different data annotations that we will not go through in this video. So now we have the product, and now we want this product to be stored in the database. So first off, we need to be able to actually work with the entity framework. And we go up into tools, or I actually think you can also right click on the project and go into manage NuGet packages. And if we go into browse, we need the entity framework. So I think if we just type entity, we get the entity framework core, and we will install that. There we go. It shows up with a green icon showing that the entity framework is now installed. Now, the entity framework is just what enables us to do this code first approach. So it's just something we need to install. And we will be working with the SQL Server. So we also need to use the entity framework SQL Server, which is right here. We will install this one. There we go. And the last one we need is the entity framework core tools. Now, the tools is what will enable us to work with the to make the migrations to the database, and I will show you exactly what that is when we get to it. There we go. Now we have the 3 packages installed that we need. We have the entity framework core, which is just the basic building block of doing this code first approach, working with the entity framework by Microsoft. The second part is simply to be able to work with a SQL Server. And the third part is to be able to write the console commands for the migrations to the database. So these are the 3 packages we need in order to work with the database using the entity framework. So I'll close that one down, and now we just need a way to connect to the database. So the way we do that is that first we need something called a connection string. Now, a connection string is just, a string that has the information on what the host is of the database, the name of the database, and we put that into the app settings JSON. We can see that's just JSON file, and we will add a new block down here. And if we actually right away, it recommends that we could put in a connection strings block here. So I'll just press that, and I will make a block. Oh, I think we made a double block there. There we go. I will make a block in the JSON file, and I will now make a connection string. And you can see it's a block, so we can have multiple connection strings. I will just name this one default connection, and I will give it a value. So it needs a few different things. It needs to know the server name. I'll just write a question mark. We separate it with a colon. Then we specify the database name. I'll just write a question mark, also separated by a colon. And we say that, a semicolon, that is, and we say that it is a trusted connection that is equal to true. So the trusted connection basically just means that we trust this connection, and I always include it. Now the server, in order to find that, we simply go into Microsoft SQL Server, and you can see the server name here is desktop something. It's going to be different on each machine. I just use the standard value it provides. I go back and I replace my question mark with the actual server name, and then I specify a database name. And I will just call this connection, database video, the same name I have given to this particular project, but you just name your database whatever you want it to be. Now that's our connection string. This contains all the information that we need in order to connect to the database. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is make something called a DB context, or a database context. It's basically just a class that will be responsible for all the communications to the database. It's sort of like a data interface layer we're implementing. So I'm just going to create a new folder. There we go, add new folder. We'll call it data. In the data folder, I will add a new class, and I will call this application DB context. There we go, and it will inherit of the DB context, which I need to import there. There we go, using the entity framework core, and it now recognizes the DB context class. Now, first off, we need a constructor for this class, and I'll just write, CTOR double tap. It's a shorthand for making a constructor, and as a parameter, we will take in DB context options. There we go. Of type application DB context, the name of our class, called options. They will get passed to the base options, so initializing the DB context superclass with the options passed into this particular DB context. So it's just a basic setup because we are inheriting from the DB context. We're just passing the options array that will be passed in here. We're just passing it up the chain to initialize this object. You don't have to think too much about this. You just need to know you have to do it. To be honest, it's like this with a lot of the configuration stuff here. You don't really need to worry too much about it. You just need to know you have to do it. So down here, we will add our tables. So the actual tables we want for our database. And we wanted the product here, but we don't necessarily want all of our models to be a table in the database. We could make models that would be responsible for, calculations or anything along those lines, any sort of business logic that we don't want stored in a table. So we have to specify which particular models we want as tables. So we make a new property, and we make it a DB set of class product. Now we also probably have to import the models folder. There we go. Whoops. and we will call it products. This is going to be the name of the table. It's going to be a DB set, so it's, it's basically just a table of the product class. So that's the way we specify a actual table in the database to be created. So now all there's left to do is to actually hook up the application to this application DB context class using the connection string we specified in here. And we do that in the program.cs file, because this is where we do all of our startup configurations. And up here in the top, we can add services to the container, and we need a block of code here. And the block of code is this one. Now, I don't type this in manually. I have this particular block of code saved on a note that I just import because it's always the same, and you don't really need to understand all that much about it. So in order to get it to work, I just jump to the red squiggly lines here, control dot, I import my data folder so it knows that class, and over here I need to import the Entity Framework core. There we go. So let's just quickly walk through what it's doing. So we are calling the builder.services add DB context. So we're adding a DB context, right? What DB context are we adding? We are adding the one we just made, the application DB context. We are passing in options, and the options will be to use a SQL Server with the configuration.getConnectionString default connection. So the default connection string is the one we made in here. See, we named it default connection, so it's very important you name it the same. If I named this local connection, I would have to change this one to local connection as well. It would do the exact same thing, because this method will look in the app settings JSON in the connection strings block for a connection string by the given name. So it's important that they match. And that's basically it. Then .NET will take the application DB context class we made, it will hook it up to the database via the connection string we made right here and defined here to the particular database. And then this DB context class will be responsible for all communications to the database. So if I say here that I want a table of products, it will make it happen. Now this is actually all we need. Now all we need to do is just push this up to the database. So I'm just going to go into SQL Server here. I'm going to connect. And if we have a look in the left-hand side, we can see databases. And there is no, what did we name the database? Let's just have a look. Connection DB video. There are no Connection DB video database whatsoever. So how do we push this to the database? How do we update it? And we can go up into Tools, and there we go. Under NuGet Package Manager, we go into the Package Manager console, and there are two commands you need to know. The first one is add migration, and then a name. We can say initialize DB with products table. So add migration is basically just a let's say a update to the database. It defines exactly what we are about to do to the database, and then you give it a name. And it is important that you give it a name that makes sense. Just, even if it's a long name, just make sure it makes sense and it really defines what you're doing. So here we are initializing the database because it's the first migration we're doing, and we are initializing with the products table as well because the products table will be created right away. So I'll press enter. It starts a build succeeded, and then we get just a few more lines. There we go, and it opens up this file. Now if we look onto the folder here of the Solution Explorer, we can see we now have a migrations folder. Now the migrations folder will contain all migrations for the project, and we can see what is opened up here is the migration it is about to perform on the database. Now nothing has been done to the database. If we go into the SQL server management studio here, we can refresh and check again. We still do not have the database. So nothing has been done yet. This is just what is about to happen. You can almost compare it like, before you push your changes to a Git. So this is just where you can review the changes. And you can see what will happen here in the up method. It will create a table called products with an ID, a name, and a price. It will even set the primary key to be ID. So even though this is not the raw SQL that will be executed, it still gives you a pretty good idea on what's about to happen. So all that's left to do is to go into the Package Manager console again and just say update database. Press enter and build started, build succeeded, and we get the last few lines here where it's executing everything in the database, and it says done. No red text, no errors, so let's see if it works. Go back into SQL Server and we refresh, go into databases, and there we go. There is now a ConnectionDB video database. We can expand that. We can go into the tables. And lo and behold, we have a products table. We also have a migrations history, and that just keeps track of all the migrations that has been done to the database. We can right-click and select the top rows just to see if the structure of the table is what we want. And there we go. It has an ID, a name, and a price. So we now have a hole through to the database, and we can work with the database through the application DB context. This is the setup that you need to perform on every single new application that you want to connect to a database. And I know it can seem like an extensive task with a lot of configuration, and the first few times I did it, I also had to really slog my way through it, and I still don't remember everything by hand. For instance, this part here, the builder method, I have this line of code or this block of code. I have it saved so I can just copy paste it into new projects. You can also just type it in by hand if you want to, but yeah, that's really up to you how you want to develop it. Installing the NuGet packages, making the application DB context, the connection strings, and all that. It's a lot of setup, and I will agree. Maybe they could have made it easier when you created a new project. I don't know. But once you get to this stage, you can really start to leverage all the magic. I mean, you can see how easy it was for us to get the model into the database. And we could just make new models and just add them to the DB context class here, and they would just get pushed up into the database. It's super easy to work with from here on out. So you just need to do this setup a few times, maybe like make a list of the things you do, or you can bookmark this video, walk through it a few times. And then once you have a project where you have this set up, you can just use that as like a cheat sheet to go back and look at what you need for the future projects you are developing. So yeah, that is actually all for this video. This is how to set up your application and to connect it to a database. So thanks a lot for watching, and yeah, I hope to see you in another video. Ciao.